But I've had a very interesting journey to Marxism. As some of you will know, on Twitter and Facebook, I've been called all sorts of things in the last couple of weeks that I've never been called before. And so I've taken a bit of time off from my busy schedule and apologising for rape and sexual assault to be here today. A lot of rumours, we all on the left, a lot of things are said about us. I was once accused of being sent over by the Eastern European Communist Party. I think it's the accent. To do what? I don't know. If it was to start the revolution, I apologise. I'll get round to it, but I've just been really busy. I think I might have missed a deadline. But I've never had this kind of thing said to me before. It's kind of interesting. So it's me and Robin Thicke. I think perhaps we should do a single together because we're obviously in the same line of work. Now, obviously, no sane person would ever think that anything like that goes on between men and women is anything but grim. But of course, as we all know, these things happen in a patriarchal, capitalist, not socialist, society. And what has surprised me is that the people who've been telling me how to be a feminist, a lot of them have been men. I appreciate that. I really do. It's fun. Have not been directing their ire at the trade unions where this has happened, the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the Conservative Party, the BBC. So, does one sense a little bit of, I'm not necessarily a big member, but does one sense a little bit of sectarianism, possibly. Anyway, here I am. And I'm here to talk about the Bryant and May matchwomen, who were women who refused to be victims and basically drove a coach and horses through the Victorian idea of what women should be. A lot of the ideas that we still struggle with today, a lot of the problems we have in gender relationships come down to the good old Victorians, bless them, who gave us stuff like the steam trains, obviously, the bicycle, that was good, but also eugenics, not quite so good. And I think their real legacy to the world is being really, really weird about sex. This is something the Victorians really excelled in. And it was particularly the case when it came to working class women. They didn't like that even as a concept. Working class women, that wasn't good at all. And the idea that they might be independent and the idea that they might be having sex or enjoying sex. Terribly threatening to the Victorians. They really come up with the idea of the bad girl, which is so beloved in the press. Even now, isn't it, that poor young woman in Magaluf? There's all starts this kind of, let's condemn it, but let's also use it to sell newspapers. Nothing new under the sun. The Victorians were really on that one. So let's have a look at our bad girl and what a Victorian woman shouldn't have been.
There is a pointer, isn't there? I'll probably break it. There.
Look at these appalling hussies. As you can see, they're luring these poor gentlemen who would otherwise be quite respectable, luring them into their dens of vice when all they want to do is just go home and see their wives and kids. And this is exactly what the Victorians thought working class women did. And they thought they were a threat to the very racial stock that by luring these poor guys into sex, they'd spread venereal disease like sort of some kind of wild animals, and they ruin everything for the decent Victorian folk. There's an image that I really like. This is from Punch magazine, and this is captioned, "George, this young woman appears to know you." This is a very awkward day for George. It's a tricky day in a marriage, I think it's fair to say. But it really sums up a lot of the hypocrisy and nonsense spoken about Victorian women, working women at this time. Because this is a working woman, she's a flower seller. She's obviously also engaging in something else after hours. And again, this is a typical picture. Poor old George there, minding his own business, and this terrible woman has been dragging him away from his wife and family, and it's all completely her fault. Now this all starts with industrialization, believe it or not. The Victorians start to get really, really scared about women and women's independence around this process. Industrialisation does two things. It makes women's labour a lot more visible. It's not so scary to have women working when they're working with husbands and fathers, in family workshops, in the fields, in agricultural work. That's okay, we can just about handle that. We can say it's an extension of their feminine duties. But to have them working in the new factories and independently getting wages paid into their own hands, that's really not good. Don't like that at all. And they're working alongside men. You know, the complete hussies, how dare they? And Labour reports at the time, which I have studied because I haven't got much of a life, if you read Labour reports at this period, they're hilarious because they're very serious reports on labour conditions on the one hand. And on the other hand, they have all these sort of weird, titillizing illustrations of women working down mines, inappropriately dressed, which obviously is the main thing we have to worry about. There's a woman down a mine, crawling on her hands and knees, pulling a cart of coal, which is chained to her waist. What we should be worrying about there is what she's wearing. That's really the key issue. And I've got an illustration which shows you a bit what I'm talking about. So that, it looks a bit like 50 Shades of Grey gone wrong, doesn't it? But this is the kind of thing, it's like partly, look at these bizarre-looking, semi-feral-looking working people, and look at them all half-naked and chained together, and God knows what's going on down there, as if it's some kind of orgy, rather than really unpleasant mine work. And let's see, I'm going to be really brave now, I'm going to see if I can make the clicker work. No, I can't. No, it's manual labour. It's a proud thing. So this is what you would be doing if you were working down a mine. There's a lot of women who are doing this kind of work. And obviously, what you should be wearing...
we really can't see it very well.
You can't see. Shall we kill a few lights? Not all of them, but a few.
We can't put any down.
No, that's the wrong one. That one I know is the that was... Yeah, that would be good actually. That's my point. I will do that. I was thinking.
Can we go back a few? Yeah, absolutely. Let's do that. That's nice. That's our 50 Shades of Grey down the mine kinky party scene. That's the actual work that a lot of women and girls are doing. That was what bothered the Victorians. They're wearing trousers. Look at them, shamelessly. And that's what you should have been wearing down the mine. If you were a proper mine worker, I can see nothing unreasonable about that at all. So, this is what working class women are up against. They're being roundly condemned and they're being blamed for everything, and not just immorality. Everything that's going wrong in society is not the fault of industrial capitalism, as you might naively have thought. Nope. It's the fault of working class women. Because they're working in factories, their children are being neglected, so their children are dying in large numbers. You might have thought that was because of poverty and starvation wages. No, it's because mum is working in the factory. The fact that working class people are drinking, and frankly I would definitely be drinking if I was doing a 16-hour shift in a factory. But no, that again is the fault of working class women. If they had only had the decency to have a nice dinner on the table, and their one room with no running water and 8 people living in it, really nice and clean and homely, then the men obviously wouldn't go down the pub, they'd come home and everything would be great. What's weird about this period, though, is that even some really quite sensible people get behind this idea of domestic ideology, this idea that women need to be back in the home, and that will solve everything at a stroke. Trade unions, some trade unions and working class men get behind it, because they're trying to go after the great Victorian prize of respectability. This is what the Victorians say about the working classes. They are not respectable. They're scarcely human, really. The real underclass is scarcely considered human. So they think this is the way we can get respectability and advance our class, is to say, oh, we absolutely agree with you. Women shouldn't work, they should be at home. And you get bizarre situations like you have weavers going to their bosses and saying, you're employing women at lower rates of pay than us. We understand why you're doing it, because some of them are our wives and daughters and we're starving and stuff, but could you not? Because they're undercutting our wages. Doesn't always happen, thank goodness. Sometimes men and women do fight and organise together and they do unionise, but you do get these bizarre anomalies thrown up. You also get that you couldn't really be a proper Victorian without holding at least 2 contradictory views at the same time. This is the opinion I've come to. It's the factory owners who have become a rising class at this period, suddenly they've got real social advancement and they can mix with the posh people and they're doing really well for themselves. So they decide we're going to define ourselves as a class. How are we going to do that? Right, we're going to take the idea, we're going to reject the aristocratic idea that gentlemen don't work, obviously, because we're working. But we rather like this lady of leisure thing. This is rather good. We'll have some of that for our own wives and daughters. On the other hand, industrialisation is a massively female process. 75% female labour in the first industries that do industrialise. So they go into work, take the profits from women's labour, and then go home and say, well, women shouldn't work, of course. This wasn't a problem for them at all. This was fine. This all made perfect sense. It's all summed up, and then you throw in the accusations about sexuality and immorality, and it all coalesces for me in a report that a mining commissioner did in the 1860s, where he says, any sight more disgustingly indecent or revolting can scarcely be imagined than these girls at work. No brothel can beat it. I wonder what Mrs. Mining Commissioner had to say about that. Now, excuse me, Henry, you seem to be rather knowledgeable about brothels and the services they offer, exactly what's going on here. But that's exactly the sort of hypocrisy that working class women are facing at this time. And, of course, how unlike the home life of their own dear queen. We've got old Vicky with hundreds of children. I don't know exactly how many. It was an awful lot, wasn't it? And she's elevating wifely devotion, feminine duty to an absolute art form. Even when her husband's, inconveniently died, she still manages to be a wife and a mourning widow. Even though she's presiding over an empire, presumably in her spare time, once the kids are in bed, working from home, she's doing a bit of empire ruling, but still thinks that feminists should be horsewhipped, and again, not in a 50 Shades of Grey kind of way. She's really, really, really against that kind of thing. So around this time, we've got the stereotype you may have come across, the angel in the house. The idea that woman should be confined to the domestic realm, that she's the kind of moral heart of the home, she's incredibly moral and divine, almost like an angelic creature, but she mustn't go outside, because if she goes anywhere she'll get really corrupted. So I'm not quite sure really what that says about the moral strength of the Victorian woman, but again, didn't bother them, that was fine. There's a poem around this time. Anyone who studied English literature may have had the misfortune to read Coventry Patmore's The Angel in the House. Ugh. It's ghastly. It's very, very, very long, and it just bangs on endlessly about how marvellous women are and how much they love pleasing their man. Man must be pleased, but him to please is woman's pleasure. Oh, isn't it just? Absolutely Coventry. Couldn't agree more. And in case you're wondering, this is apparently based on a real woman. His wife, Emily Patmore, there she is. Looking a bit pissed off, you would, wouldn't you? But she was Coventry Patmore's first wife and she died young. Can't blame you, Emily, at all. That's exactly what I would have done. But this is where the stereotype comes from, and it's such a powerful stereotype. It's so good at condemning women, hitting them really where they live, making them think that they're not respectable women, they're not lovable women, they're not going to get a husband unless they're suitably feminine and preferably not working. Historians find really strange things. You research women's lives and you have people say, well, my grandmother always said she didn't work once she was married. Did she? Well, she took in washing and she worked in the jam factory and she pickled onions at home and she made matchboxes at home, but she didn't really work once she was married. So even women get sucked into this kind of domestic ideology. Of course they do. Because it strikes at the very heart of who they are if they're told they won't have a husband and a family and they won't be loved unless they behave in this fashion. Virginia Woolf gave a very interesting speech to some women in the 1920s, and she spoke about the angel in the house stereotype, and what she said was really interesting. She said, now you're all a lot younger than me, something I often have to say in talks, I must say, at schools and so on. She said, you won't understand what I'm talking about, that there's this awful stereotype that I was stuck with. So even as a very middle-class woman, with servants, Virginia Woolf suffered from this stereotype too. And she said, when I'm writing, when I'm working, the angel in the house creeps onto my shoulder and whispers in my ear, but have the men had enough to eat? Is father sitting in a draft? Should you really be doing this, you're really being incredibly selfish. This is rather unfeminine, this writing malarkey. And she said, I murdered the angel with an ink pot. Good for her. But she said to these women, you won't have these pressures when you're growing up. Ah ha ha! Bitter laughter all round. So, that was middle-class women. So for factory girls, even worse. Criticised at every turn and having to work endlessly in the most appalling drudgery, the most appalling health and safety conditions. You know, the ones the government want us to have again now. We have basically no health and safety conditions. Occasionally, the middle classes and upper classes do admit that some of these working class people are actually working quite hard. They're not just down the pub, but only when something happens like an outbreak of cholera, which really makes them have to pay attention to working class conditions. Or this report that was in the press in 1888 about the death of a woman called Sophia Hill. On the 31st of July, she returned home from work feeling very unwell. Her husband had noticed her getting weaker from want of food for some time past, as he had been unable to procure sufficient to sustain them. He earned nothing, and his wife's earnings were not more than 6 shillings a week. On the Wednesday morning she got worse, but refused to allow him to fetch the relieving officer. He called in Dr. Harvey, who prescribed brandy and left the money to pay for it. No hopes were given of her recovery, and at 7:30 p.m. she died. Now, this dying woman is asking her husband not to call the doctor because they can't afford it. Again, something that our government would love to, with its attacks on the NHS, this is where they would like us to be again. So for many mothers, for women like Sophia Hill, life is a grim, constant fight to get through each day, to feed and clothe a growing family, whilst also working 12 to 16 hours a day in factories or at home for very low wages for what is called the sweated trades. Despite what the upper classes liked to think about the working classes and this, great party they were having, this is what working class life actually looked like. And this is in the East End, where I'm going to set my scene for the matchwomen strike. This is a whole family working at home. The father is the only one who would have been called a tailor, but you can see everybody's working. You can also see that there are beds in the corners of the picture because this is their home. This one room is where they live. This is where you eat, sleep, cook, work, and do everything. This made working class life particularly tough. If you read people's memoirs, they were permanently absolutely knackered because you couldn't get a decent night's sleep. You were sharing a bed, if you've got a bed, with 3 or 4 brothers and sisters. Someone's always ill, someone's always coughing, so the baby's always crying, and possibly, Granny's dying in the corner, or possibly you can't afford a coffin for Granny who has died in the corner, and she's going to be there for a few days while you work that one out. So, absolutely awful. And also, another thing that people say is the Beatles. There was a plague of black Beatles in working class towns and cities, and particularly the East End. And one woman said in her memoir, it was our nightly game before we went to bed, me and my brothers and sisters, to chase these buggers up the wall and try and squash them with our boots before we went to sleep, because they'd be biting us all night and you'd have fleas and bed bugs. So, it was horrifically grim, and that was life for the majority of people at the height of the Victorian Empire, while some people, of course, are doing incredibly well out of industrialisation. And commentators on the docks, the East End docks, would say, the irony and the hypocrisy of seeing the dockers, who were incredibly badly paid, unloading all the silks and spices and the sumptuous goods from around the empire, which they're never going to be able to afford to buy themselves. So in the East End, in the Victorian East End, it was the Bryant and May matchwomen who were your archetypal factory girls. Bryant and May Matches was the biggest employer of what they called female casual labour. Now, of course, when they say casual, they don't mean it was a bit of a DOS, and you were sort of sitting there going, yeah, I'll make some matches in a minute, I'm just having a chat. It meant your employer was incredibly casual about your working conditions, absolutely, and your pay, but it didn't mean that anything was casual or easy for you. Now, people didn't like the matchwomen, even before they went on strike. They really put the wind up the middle classes in the East End. They were quite famous in the East End for their behaviour, which I'm afraid, was not the behaviour of respectable Victorian women. They dressed all wrong as well. Again, the fight is over women's appearance and women's bodies, as it still is today. Because if you were going to insist on being poor, and the Victorians really did think that you did insist on being poor, it was a lifestyle choice, you know, they're really strange, these working classes. Do you know they all live in one room? Well, I prefer to live in a 5-bedroom mansion, but no, you go down the East End and you will see they're all living in one room with a pig if they're Irish. It's very strange. And people genuinely do think that this is a choice that people have made. The way they dress, now they should be, if you have to be poor, if you have to be a working woman, a factory woman, and you have to be of Irish descent, which I'm afraid these lot were as well, to make matters even worse, at least be completely quiet about it. You know, be embarrassed about your status. Creep around quietly wearing beige. No. Matchwomen showed a distinct lack of enthusiasm for doing that. Instead, they wore very bright clothes, Victorian bling. They wore little high-heeled boots. They've got their own hairstyles. They've got very fringed hairstyles, as you'll see in another photograph that I've got. And hats. Now, hats were a massive thing for the matchwomen, but they couldn't afford them on their wages. So what they did, and I really do love this, is they formed feather clubs. You had a feather club, you paid in a penny a week, or whatever you could afford. And when you had enough money, Elsie went down to the milliners and bought a hat, and you all shared it. You had communal hats. So if you had a date with a gas worker or a docker on the Saturday night, you would get the hat. It would be, bring it back in one piece. It better be in good nick when you bring it back, and then someone else would have it. I think it's absolutely brilliant. But again, the hats were wrong, I'm afraid. The hats were not modest little bonnets. The hats were enormous. They went for the biggest hats they could get, with the brightest feathers, and this really irks the middle class. Who do they think they are, these women? Because, of course, what they were doing was taking back the class and gender prejudice that was thrown at them and throwing it right back in the face of the middle classes and going, we know what you say about us, you know what? Fingers up, basically. Here we are in our big hats, and people were quite scared of them. It's really interesting. At the same time as condemning working class women and demonising them, they're also really scared. And people would say, you have to make sure you know, if you live in the East End, when the matchwomen shifts end, so that you can be indoors, because you don't want to be out on the streets, because the language, shocking, the language. And also they're really cheeky, they're rude, they're insolent to passers-by. In other words, they're confident and they take pride in their working class status. Now this is terrible, we can't have this. If women start taking pride in their class, rather than being cowed by it, they're going to start getting greedy and asking for things like food, decent housing and decent working hours, and then how are we going to make our profits? You know, we absolutely don't want any of that. A local magistrate also said that even if you couldn't see the matchwomen, and you usually could, then you could hear them a mile off. Match girls come out very strong on a Saturday night, when any number of them may be found at the Paragon Music Hall, the Foresters Music Hall in Cambridge Road, and the Seabright at Hackney. The Eagle in the City Road, still a pub now, that's the one in the nursery rhyme, up and down the City Road, in and out the Eagle. That's the way the money goes, because it did, for a lot of working class women. They're very fond of dancing, but they're even more attached to singing. They seem to know by heart the words of all the popular music hall songs of the day, and their homeward journey on bank holidays, though musical, is decidedly noisy. It is a little irritating to the quiet, loving citizen. It's hard to imagine Mrs. Coventry Patmore and her friends coming home after a night at the music hall singing Tarara Boomdier at the top of their voices, isn't it? And this, of course, was exactly the problem. So when I was researching the matchwomen and the strike, which I'll be talking more about in a minute, one of the problems, obviously, was that they all inconveniently died and no one's interviewed them at the time. My premise is this is a hugely important strike that has been talked down by history, hidden by history rather than from history, because of the shocking nature, even now, of a bunch of illiterate, working-class Irish teenagers and young girls having done something really important, having gone on strike on purpose. Surely not. Surely they didn't know they were exploited, because nobody had read the Marx cover to cover. So how would they possibly have known? So history really talks them down. Because they weren't interviewed in their lifetime, I wanted to trace grandchildren. I wanted to talk to people who've known them. And time was really ticking on that one when I started my research. And I did. I was lucky enough, eventually, it was a really long process to meet people who had known the matchwomen. Incredibly strong women. It's hard to avoid all the cliches of these sort of tough women with a heart of gold who like playing the old Joanna. They did, they really did, and like going down the pub and like their gin and their jelly deals and all that kind of thing. And they were fighters. They were really tough women. They had to be. The East End streets were very dark. There was no street lighting, and sexual assault and sexual abuse was rife. One of the things you had to be able to do as a woman was to chase men away from the women of your family to stop this happening. Sometimes people made their own fun out of that, apparently. There was one incident I was told about when one of the grandmothers was in the bookies lining up to place a bet. And a toff, as I was told, a toff came in. Now, you didn't get posh people in the East End, so it was a bit of a notable event, was that. And this chap, I don't know, in a top hat or something, came and stood behind Grandma, and the local lad who was queuing up behind him thought, I know what I'm going to do here. So he reached round the posh guy and pinched Grandma's bum, and Grandma swung round, fist first, asking no questions, and knocked the poor guy out with one punch. Well, there was no television in those days. You know, you had to make your own fun, didn't you? Even up until the 1960s, Martha Robertson, who's one of the matchwomen I talk a lot about in my book, I was talking to her grandson, who unfortunately is not too well now, Ted, but he's a fantastic guy. And he was saying, yeah, even in the 1960s, I'd go down the pub with Grandma, and, you know, we'd always have the same conversation. Shall I get you a drink, Grandma? Oh, no, Ted, you keep your money, love. Well, go on then. Just the one. 5 double gins later. And she just had a hip operation, and she was on crutches, and they were in a pub, and you know that feeling you get when a fight's about to break out, it's all about to kick off in the pub, and she went, yes, go kick off, Ted, not to worry, son. Prop me up in the corner, I'll be fine. I've got my crutches, I can take them all off. And she went out drinking with her fellow matchwomen, even you know, very close to her death. And there's these fantastic pictures of these incredibly tough-looking women. You know those things you go to see something, you put your head through the slot, and it's like you picture someone in a bathing costume, and there they all are, sort of, you know, obviously quite pissed, having their photos taken at the seaside on their what they call their beanos. Absolutely brilliant. So, matchwomen, very famous figures in the neighbourhood, even though they were not, they fell short of the ideals of respectability. A lot of the women whose families I talked to had lovers outside marriage, and they liked to drink, and, you know, they were no stranger to fistfights. But apparently you could just about get away with that and still be respectable if you, what they call, fronted it out. You know, what about it? And these women were still highly respected. They were the midwives in the street, they were the ones who laid out the dead, they were the ones that people went to. One of the people whose grandparents I interviewed during the war, when soldiers were sent back, the First World War, soldiers were sent back so badly injured without any identification that they weren't recognisable. She was the one that they brought round the hospital wall to say who was who. And her own husband was there, who was supposed to have been dead, and so bandaged up that he looked like the invisible man, but she recognised him and fainted, and he came home with her. No sick pay, nothing to help her whatsoever in those days, of course. So she nursed this guy who's so badly deformed, you can see it in all the photographs, until he died, and also massively shell-shocked and really depressed, and absolutely no help whatsoever for it. But that was your typical life, incredibly hard. And yet, these are the ones criticised by the working classes for being insolent, you know, for having the temerity to try to enjoy life sometimes, and for holding their heads up high. That solidarity that came out of their really difficult lives was incredibly important in the workplace. A lot of historians, labour historians, haven't taken any account of that. They write about strikes and workforces as mainly male. They don't consider people's families, people's home lives. Of course, if you have a strong network between you and your neighbours and your sisters and your aunts and your mums, and you all work in the same factory, then you have a natural kind of solidarity, which obviously you're going to bring to that situation. And yet male historians, not just male historians, but historians have been amazed, you know, how could these women possibly stand up for each other? You know, again, they weren't educated, they hadn't been to school or anything, it's amazing. But of course, when you look at their lives, it's absolutely natural that they would have done. Now, conditions in the Bryant and May factory were absolutely appalling, not because Bryant and May couldn't afford decent conditions. They were doing amazingly well. They were a huge concern, not just in the UK, but also globally. And they were the matchmakers. They had match factories all over the country, and they took over other match factories as well. So it might be called Bell's, actually Bryant and May are behind it. So they're making a killing. They became a firm 4 years before the matchwomen strike, and things got worse for the women then. Profits went up. Shareholders were getting 20% dividends on their wages. Bryant and May's response, and this is my answer to anyone who says that if you have unalloyed capitalism and trade unions don't mess it up, wealth will trickle down to the workers. 20% dividends to shareholders, starvation wages to the workers, wages lower in 1888 than they had been 10 years before. Why? Because Bryant and May could. So they did. They pushed wages down, they formed a cartel. Absolutely no need to do it whatsoever. You know, they could have paid 10% dividends and actually the workers could have been able to afford to live, but no. No disapproval whatsoever, of course. That's capitalism, isn't it? That's fair business practice. Try and form a trade union. Oh, no, we're interfering in that business practice. Like MPs now saying, well, I got elected on less than 30% of a turnout on a vote, but you can't go on strike on less than that, you know. Talk about moving the goalpost in an unlevel playing field. But it's not only the fact that they're starving, and they are, and Annie Besant, who's a journalist who writes about the matchwomen and exposes conditions, says, if you look at the youngest girls, and here's some of them here, they would have been 11, 12, 14, or even 13 as well, where if you look at them, you can see they're the ones who should have been growing physically when these really low wages came into play. And they just haven't grown. They're tiny, even for working class Victorian girls. They're tiny, they're frail, because they're malnourished. You know, they're literally working full time and starving. One of the girls talked to Annie Besant when she wrote her expose for her political paper called The Link, and she said, well, it's not just that we're paid so badly, although we are, they also fine us. For any little misdemeanour really, for talking, for having dirty feet. I've never quite been able to work out how that would impact on your ability to make matches. It was just basically to control the women and to have a go at them for any signs of sort of independence or individuality. And this girl said, well, let me give you an example. There was a machine that me and my mates were working with, and it cut our fingers. So I altered the webbing on it so it wouldn't cut our fingers. Now, it still worked absolutely fine. But the foreman found out, you know, gave me a clip round the ear and made me put it back how it was. And fined me, and he said to me, the machine is more valuable than you are. Well, hey, that's a business case analysis, isn't it? That's absolutely how people behave nowadays. And yes, that was what, you know, she was completely dispensable. There were thousands of unemployed people on the streets of East London. She could be replaced within minutes. She was, you know, complete irrelevance, really, to the production process. But worse than that, and you might have heard of this if you've heard about the matchwomen, was necrosis of the jaw caused by white phosphorus. Now, you might have heard people talk about phossy jaw, because that's what the women and girls called it. I think I've got an unpleasant picture. No, I haven't. Are you all right? I sometimes do the rotten jawbone thing. 30 minutes have gone. Okay, I'll try and speed it up a bit. What you would get initially would be toothache and the swelling of your lower face. And the jawbone decays while you're still alive. Pieces of bone are pushed through the holes in your gums, which you would have because you couldn't afford the dentist as a working class person in those days. Eventually you would die. It was a horrible death. But I think the saddest thing about it was the odour from the decay of your bones was so unpleasant that even family members couldn't stand to have sufferers under their roof. And you hear factory inspectors find people living like lepers, match workers, on the outskirts of towns and cities. So that's Annie Besant's piece, in essence. That's exactly what she talks about. She talks about phossy jaw, and she talks about the terrible conditions and pay of these women. What she didn't expect was that they would then go on strike. Now, a few days after her piece was published in The Link, that's exactly what they did. And what happens then is so interesting, because pretty much all the historians who've written about the strike, some haven't, because it's only girls going on strike, doesn't really matter, move on, nothing to see here. But those that have written about it have said, well, obviously, there you go, Annie Besant made them go on strike. How do you do that? How do you make 1,400 people go on strike? Because I've tried, and it's quite hard work, actually. That's where I came in, a trade union steward, not in fact sent by the East European Communist Workers Party, but a trade union steward who'd always done crappy jobs, got very interested in trade unions and in labour history, knew very little about it. I went down to do my first essay for my T&G labour history course, and I thought, I can't write 1,000 words about something, good grief! I haven't done an essay since my O-levels, and they didn't go well. But what I thought was, I'm going to do those matchwomen, because how did that woman make them go on strike? How? I've been involved with strikes with East End women. And if you were to swan down to the factory gates as a complete outsider, not a match worker, and say, hello, you don't know me, but I'm Annie Besson, I'm a Fabian, and we've had a vote, and you are going on strike because, you know, me and George Bernard Shaw have decided. So see you here Wednesday. And what are they going to say? Yes, God bless you, Ma'am. Absolutely, Ma'am, we'll be there. No, I'll tell you what they're going to say. Well, I won't tell you what they're going to say, because it won't be printable. But nonetheless, that was the story. So I thought, right, let's see what her tactics were. I could use some of it, you know. What did she say to them? What did she promise them? How on earth did she pull this off? And I was amazed. I trotted down to the Bryant and May archives. I was amazed at the lack of information in all the history books. It was all just, well, Annie Besson was sort of left-wing and she wrote a piece about them and so they went on strike. You know, because we all know that's a very, very simple process. Now the Fabians, they're not your out-and-out archetypal syndicalists, really, at this point. You know, George Bernard Shaw and Rosa Luxemburg have never been confused with each other. Even never seen the same room, mind you, so, you know. But I really couldn't understand it when I looked at Fabian politics and George Bernard Shaw going, don't really like trade unions, don't really like strikes, don't really like working class people, to be honest. You know, and saying that Fabian society succeeds because we're all middle class and we can talk to each other and understand each other and we're all terribly sensible. So I'm looking into it and I look at the Bryant and May archives, and this is what everyone should always do with history, with your own family history, with any strike you've been involved in, with any interesting bit of local history. Go to the original sources, don't listen to historians, don't believe everything that's written in books except mine. Mine is the only book ever written which is 100% factually and politically correct. The others, ignore. Go back to the original documents, and there I find immediately, as somebody who likes a bit of a strike, you're not supposed to say that, I don't really like strikes, love them. As a trade unionist, I was thinking, well, here's Bryant and May saying, we know who started this strike, we know who the troublemakers are, there's 5 women in particular who we think, they're naughty, on our naughty list, and we think they began the strike. Well, hang on a minute, it began inside the workplace, did it? Well, how can it have been influenced by Annie Besant? Then I looked at what actually happened. I went right through, I thought, right, I've got something here. I've really got to look into this and see what happened. This could be quite important. So I started making out my timeline of events and what had happened. Getting together every account I could in the most haphazard way imaginable on my living room floor of my flat, with accounts from local papers and people's diaries and journals and everything I could come up with, to try to trace even the dates, because historians haven't really bothered, they've written about it in a line or two. And there I find Annie Besson in her journal saying, a couple of days into the strike, as I had calculated, do you know, I got really interrupted at work today because I was trying to work and there was this noise outside, and I looked out the window and there were all these scruffy girls out there. They were matchwomen apparently, and they came to see me and apparently they were on strike. Well, you know, I've organised some strikes with workers, and okay, we're not always completely on it or focused, but come on, you know, really, if you've led a strike, you ought to know it's happened, really. I think that's your minimum. That's strike leading 101. Be aware it started. That's really, you know, it's quite a good thing. Then she says in the link immediately, the girls will go back to work. Basically what she's saying is, oh shit, 1,400 women and girls parading the streets of the East End, collecting money, singing rude songs about Bryant and May. Oh my God, they've got no money. What are we going to do now? If she planned the strike, you would have strike funds in place, wouldn't you? She's got some rich mates, George Bernard Shaw, Oscar Wilde, he was one of her socialist buddies, now he was worth a few bob. She'd have passed the hat round and got something sorted, but she didn't. The women didn't go back to work, and they had no intention whatsoever of going back to work, and they had been on strike before. You would think this was the only strike of women ever. Not only had they been going on for hundreds of years before this, they'd been happening in the match factory before this. It was a short strike, it only went on for 2 weeks, and immediately, exactly what you would expect happened. The press went, how very dare they? Bryant and May are lovely chaps, and they're gentlemen. Who the hell do they think they are? They should be grateful to have a job. Quick as I can, yes, and they shouldn't go on strike. And and horrified. But then it gets really embarrassing for them because shareholders are MPs and clergymen. This comes out in the press, and Annie Besant gives that a good push in the press as well. Ex-husband to clergyman, I'm sure there was no connection with that, but she does seem to rather enjoy pointing that out. So it's a bit embarrassing, you know, your day job is to support the poor and oppressed, and oops, making 20% dividends from young girls and women in the East End being starved and given necrosis of the jaw by a company that you support. Political pressure grows on Bryant and May, and they give in with the worst grace possible. There was no sort of, oh, we've seen the error of our ways, and actually, yeah, we could pay them a little bit more. Furious! Absolutely furious. I was in the archives recently reading their sort of quite unpublished correspondence, and even a year after the strike, this is what I love about employers, they're still going, it wasn't our fault, it wasn't our fault, it's lovely working here, it's brilliant. They had absolutely no need to go on strike. The reason they went on strike was Bryant and May bullied them over Annie Besant's article, tried to get them to sign papers saying they loved working with Bryant and May and they were one big happy family. The women refused and one girl was sacked. Now there's no way that Annie Besant could have organised all of that, even the most brilliant organiser, even if she'd been remotely aware of what was going on, which she wasn't. So, the women win. It's an extraordinary victory. Bryant and May was an incredibly powerful company. They go back to work. Bryant and May had threatened not to have any of them back. They have to. They said they couldn't form a trade union. They had to let them. And they formed the largest union of women and girls in the country at the time. And it didn't stop there. They went around recruiting other women as well. They'd be in the jam factories, the sweetie factories, the confectionery shops, talking to miners' wives, dockers' wives, and organising them. As a result, a few months later, there's an attempted strike on the East End docks. It fails, but this is the rehearsal, and the matchwomen's union are completely involved in it and approached by the dockers for the Great Dock Strike of 1889. That's traditionally called the start of the union movement. It's a bit like, well, the women have done it, so let's wait till some men come and do it, and then we'll call that the start, and that'll be fine. Not what the dockers said. To be fair, I wouldn't expect an East End Irish working class docker to have the best views on gender, but if you read their reports, they all said, no, match girls, it was them. We didn't think it could be done, and they did it, and they showed us that it could be done, and they were our inspiration and our example, as they are mine, and that's why I hold the Matchwomen's Festival now, just done my second one. It's very exciting this year, lots of controversy, which is for trade union people and, you know, women and those who like them, even men, we even let men speak, to celebrate these incredible women, because what they did was so incredibly brave and so courageous. From them grew the modern trade union movement. From that came the Labour Party. Well, you know, they did their best. You can't get everything right. It's a battle that has to be refought. And why does it have to be refought? The best quick example I can give you is that 1,400 matchwomen went on strike that day in 1888. 1,300 men and women are killed every year at work in the UK. Does it get in the news? No, it doesn't. Has health and safety gone mad? If only it bloody had. The health and safety executive has been cut to the bone. 17% of accidents now properly investigated, which is an absolute travesty. After the first festival, MPs debated the matchwomen's legacy in Parliament, which was really great. I was there to see Ed Vaizey squirming and saying that Michael Gove would absolutely love to read my book. He wouldn't. He wouldn't like it at all. And that, you know, Michael Gove will read her book, and yes, I will think about putting it on the syllabus. See, either he's going to read my book or it's going to go on the school syllabus. The two things aren't going to happen at all. What's important about that day, the 8th of October last year, is that on that day, a young building worker called Daniel Yeovil, 23 years old, died building a primary school in the East End of London. But that didn't get into the national press. And it's for that reason that I hope to see you all on the 4th of July. It's for that reason that we have to fight to defend the rights that these incredible women, our Victorian bad girls, the mothers of the modern Labour movement, fought for and gave to us. Thank you.
Everybody should read the book, actually, because there's a lot more information that, for example, between the relationship between the women matchworkers and the dockers. Because, the same kind of thing, family solidarity, was very much part of the story, that you know, the dock labourers, Irish dock labourers, they were the cousins and the uncles and the fathers of the matchwomen. And, you know, there's interesting work, you know, they lived in the same streets. And, you know, it's really interesting as well, because the East End spirit, you know, it's still, I remember a few years ago, you can still see it. There was an occupation of a health centre on the Isle of Dogs, which got totally rebuilt, actually. It was an occupation on the estate. And there was a group of pensioners, you know, older East End women, sat in there, occupying, and the local woman, who was also a member of the Labour Party, came down and said, I understand your feelings and sympathise with you. We will do something about it. I've got my diary here, and if you would leave, we'll arrange a meeting, and we're not leaving. Okay. And then she said, okay, I've got no alternative but to call the police. And of course, you know, the response would have been the same. Call the effing police. You know, there's a bit of an East End tradition there, which, like, you can really understand, you know, the matchwomen. But the other thing is, it's really interesting. It's like, if you read Hobsbawm and that, there's very little reference to it, you know. And that is the thing, is I think about what came out of it, you know, that this whole spirit, the new unionism, and actually, you know, other stuff, that fantastic things happened all across the country, this kind of self-activity from below, and it's kind of got written out. And I think that's because what happened after is, if you look at people like the leadership of that, you know, when the strike wave went down, Will Thorne, you know, he ended up being a Labour MP, Ben Tillett, you know, very important in the dock strike, ended up being, you know, flattered by the ruling class and actually became a recruiting sergeant in the First World War, you know, because they were, so in a way, Hobsbawm and people came up, you know, it's kind of, because they don't see the importance, you know, we always have to look at the important things, that self-activity from below. You know, it was Irish women, it was migrant workers, you know, so you see it again and again, the SOAS strikers, the Ealing strikers, they're the people we've got to look to. And, you know, it's a beautiful book about this, you know, it's part of our history. You know, we've got to spread it. I hope it does get on there. You know, I doubt if it will, but it should get on the syllabus. But everybody should read it and, you know, get involved. And, you know, Louise has done a really, really good job. And we need to, you know, to make it live as well. The point is, you know, it's only if we learn the lesson. What does it mean? Self-activity from below, migrant workers, the people at the bottom of society are the people that not going to challenge things, but create a new society, not, you know, just say we will get a Labour MP out of it, God forbid. You know.
Yeah, I read Louise's book a couple of years as well, so I forgot to do my revision before I came to the meeting. It's a very good book, and I think what Louise really did, which was very different, was instead of looking at the matchwomen through Annie Besant, really looked at it through the workers who were involved, and that was something that I found particularly refreshing about it. There was the idea constantly that Annie Besant comes along and saves the matchwomen sort of from themselves, and really, of course, that wasn't the case at all. I've got a question about that I'm going to come to later, but I think as well it's important to say that the matchwomen weren't the only radical women striking at that time, and there's a lot of other very interesting examples. That it's around the time that Louise's book came out, I was doing some research of my own. There's an example of a tin box factory in London where 60 women just walked out on a spontaneous strike over conditions and pay. My particular favourite, because I'm from East Ham, was the Cross and Blackwell workers in East Ham who so basically peel onions all day long with 400 onion peelers going out for better pay there as well. And they form a union out of it too. And what we really see at this point is a really exciting time, I think, of that sort of birth, if you like. But it's often treated, as the speaker before said, and as Louise indicated too, as a sort of blip in Labour history, when of course it's anything but. And when you read about some of these workers, I think I read an account about some of the dockers at the time as well. They really are the original precarious workers, if you like. The dockers at this time go down to the docks, have to wait around in the morning to see whether they're going to get work. I read a report which talked about them trying to break each other's legs, so one of them would get work over the others. Really, and you're thinking that they really are the original precarious workers. I think the matchwomen are an inspiration, but they're also, we have to take those lessons from that too, about how, you know, when we're talking about 0 hours contracts, it's something that's very relevant today. So it's not just an inspiring time, I suppose, but quite an instructive time in that sense as well.
I wanted to ask a question about immigration. Because, you know, Marx, writing in the 19th century about the Irish worker, says the ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor. This antagonism is kept alive by the press, the pulpit and the comic papers. This is the secret impotence of the British working class and the ruling class knows it. Was that true? Was Marx right? And secondly, what was the nature of solidarity in the East End? Did people think, I'm not quite sure about these people from Ireland, but they're fighting for us all? Was it a unified movement around the strike? Was there support from other people who weren't Irish? And, was there a general sense of a movement that was sharp, not a movement maybe, but of a working class that was sharply divided by whether they were indigenous or immigrant? Or were there at least moments in which that was overcome? Because, I'm not trying to paint any glorious picture, but at least the moments of unity are very important. Was there a top-hatted Nigel Farage? have you traced that back?
Just a question, really. I mean, when you look at, the conditions the Mexican strikers worked in the Victorian period, and today, when I look at it, I go to this local history group, and this is sort of the main period we should speak about all the time, because I think the reason for that is because many of the government's politics, policies at this present time reflects that period. The whole issue of the undeserving poor. These people on benefits. Are undeserving the benefits that they're getting, you know what I mean? And these are 0 hours and they're even looking at welfare, working for not getting paid for work. You do a 9 to 5. You go into a factory or a shop and work 9 to 5 for nothing. You know what I mean? You can get a reward for thanks for coming, thanks for working. It's same policies. I mean, I'm waiting for when this calm-down Tory government is going to remodel the workhouse. So that's the question. How much their politics reflects the Victorian times.
I'm not used to public speaking at all in any way, so I hope you'll forgive me if it comes out a little bit erratic.
Is that right?
I want to ask a question actually, is what effect did the matchwomen strike have on the working class towards the turn of the century, and also how did it affect the suffragette movement at that time? That's all I want to ask.
Yeah.
I want to ask a quick question about trade union representation, because I've never been quite clear whether the match workers formed their own union or whether they were part of another union. Because when Siobhan was talking about the Cross and Blackwell strike and various others, there was quite a lot all the way down the River Lee and into Newham. And the big workplace in Newham was the gasworks, which was the birth of what's now the GMB. Now the GMB had specific, or whatever it was called then, the Gasworkers Union, had specific women's branches, including the Canning branch, which had 1,200 members. So these were serious organisations that organised a lot of people. At the same time, one of the things that comes out so nice in your book is that kind of sense of independence. And yet, you do get already the emergence of a trade union leadership which A, doesn't work, and B, is almost exclusively male. So can you make a few comments on how that came about and at what stage?
Right, yes, there were lots of strikes by other women. We have recorded strikes in 1788. only, not before that, because that's pretty much when the records began, it was the only weapon you had as working class people in those days was to withdraw your labour. So yes, people have always done it. In 1788, Leicester hand spinners dumped strike breakers under a water pump. Bloody good idea, I think. Excellent work. Yeah, really militant, massive spinners union in Leicester. Strikes happened all the time. They happened all the time at Bryant and May before this and after this. They happened in almost every industry without trade unions because it was all they could do. And some people said to me, well, they couldn't strike, that they had too much at stake. But in a way, there was nothing else they could do. They had so much at stake that the only thing they could do to fight for it was to withdraw their labour. Yes, there are absolutely other important strikes. You only have to look at the index of industrial action after the matchwomen go back to work. There are strikes happening all the time in the Victorian UK. They're happening all the time before and afterwards as well. This is a huge incidence of strike increasing after this, and it rolls into new unionism. Absolutely, it's really important. Yes, other stories. If I could spend my life writing about stories like this and uncovering them, I really would. I don't mean to ever suggest it's just the matchwomen. Just so happens I like to use them as a great example of what history does to working class women, and also as a kind of learning moment. I like to go into schools, not just because it would really piss Michael Gove off, but that's a really good reason to do anything, obviously. I like to go into schools to indoctrinate, talk to children about, because I think they're brilliant role models, especially for young teenage girls. Better than a celebrity who's lost 20 pounds and married a footballer. Here were young teenagers who changed the world. So they're just a really brilliant example to coalesce around and to unite people around. I don't ever suggest they're the only ones. What you said about people saying that the dockers at the call-ons, which we'd have thousands of men fighting for work, climbing on each other's back to get the foreman's attention, the idea that people would break each other's legs, that was exactly what the middle classes liked to say about the working classes. They are too stupid, A, and too desperate, B, to have any idea about politics. All they're trying to do is trample each other down to get their own advantage. Well, starving people will fight for work, we all would, regardless of our class background. But there was an incredible solidarity as well. And actually the dock strike and the matchwomen strike changed people's minds. Middle class commentators go, oh my God, who knew? The working classes, some of them can talk, which we didn't really realise, like in whole sentences and stuff. And they know things. Some of them, I met one who'd read a book. And they know what they're doing. They're looking after each other. They've got an incredible solidarity. This was blindsiding, trust me, for most middle class people who were used to this underclass idea of feral chavs, we get it now, don't we? Feral underclass, attacking each other and ripping each other to shreds. Better stay away from them, including the trade union movement. Better stay away from them because they'll take you down with them. They're just going to be fighting. That's all they know how to do. So this changes minds. Commentators say this has changed our opinion of the working classes. That's the matchwomen strike and the dockers strike. Really, really important in that sense. Immigration, yes, it is true that Marx, I presume you mean Eleanor, my personal favourite. No, that's pretty good as well. Yes, there was competition between workers, but if you look at some of the famous events that people talk about, when protectionism was supposed to be at its height. If you go back and look again at accounts of these sort of meetings and fights that are supposedly occurring over really narrow protectionist politics, which is supposed to be all the working classes are capable of, there are also people opposing that. There are working class men and women saying, no, you are paid agitators, you've been sent, and we know who sent you and we know who's paid you. You've been sent down here to tell us that we only care about jobs for English men and women, and it's absolutely not true. There was anti-Irish sentiment, absolutely, no question about it. There was also incredible solidarity, doesn't get written about very much. There was a lot of solidarity in the East End. Everyone was collecting for the match workers. You can see it when you look at the accounts of who gave money to them. Even the matchbox makers, who were even poorer, were having collections for the factory women in the East End. It's just exactly what you did. Partly, I'm not saying because they were all so angelic and altruistic, but to survive. If you're poor, you understand that if someone comes over from Ireland and they're a vague relative of yours, you give them a room in your house, you help them find somewhere to live. If Mrs. So-and-so next door is starving because her bloke's lost his job at the docks, you say you've made too much food and you send the nipper over with the casserole and you give her some extra food. It's practical, common sense understanding that we are all in this together, just like us and our government. And you have to help each other out. That is solidarity in its most basic form. And I think that is political. To me, that is political, because the person is very political. That is people standing out for each other. And I think it's desperately important. The deserving and undeserving poor thing, yes, the Victorians are so responsible for the ideological mess we're in even now, over sexism and misogyny, and definitely over ideas about the poor. I can show you Victorian newspapers and clips from the Daily Mail, you would not be able to tell them apart, really, in terms of their attitudes about working class people, except the Victorian ones probably be a little bit better written. Absolutely true that it all starts with the Victorians, and they like to think, they really genuinely say things like, well, they're poor because they want to be, they're poor because they don't want to work, but they're working 16 hours a day. Yeah, well, some of them, but the rest of them, they don't want to work, and you can see it in the Daily Mail now. They spend all their money on booze and fags, they're spending their benefits down the book. Absolutely nothing has changed in that. We have to know that this was a deliberate ideological attack on the working class to excuse poverty and inequality. We have to be able to trace it back to its roots so we can take it on today, because it's still happening today and it always will. We all know, you've only got to read Wilson and Pickett's Spirit Level, a country, people, human beings. The human race feels better if there's equality in society, but that does not help some people to get very, very rich. So they will attack that notion and any kind of move towards equality in any way they can. And they'll say it's just human nature. Oh, it's human nature. Somebody always wants to be rich. And, trade unions are irrelevant and they're against human nature and so forth. It's all a load of bollocks. So to ignore it. What effects did the strike have? There was a huge wave of strikes in the East End the week after the matchwomen's victory. There were more strikes than there had been for the previous 3 years. Not just in the East End, they spread all over the country. People in Ireland, seamstresses in Dublin write and they say, will you please tell us, we've heard about the matchwomen's strike. They didn't even have the Twitter then, did they? But they knew, because obviously a victory of the working classes, the casual poor, the most put upon and exploited people, it is not going to be lost on you if you're in exactly that position. It's a brilliant good news story. You're going to be incredibly impressed by it. So actually they ask Eleanor Marx to go over to Dublin, and she does, and to talk about trade unionism. Suffragettes, you can't prove, or I haven't been able to prove, but maybe one day I'm going to try, that there were matchwomen in the East London Federation of Suffragettes, these ELFs, I just love the fact they're called the ELFs, set up by Sylvia Pankhurst, the Pankhurst it's okay to like, and the only Pankhurst it's truly okay to like. I would be amazed when you read Sylvia Pankhurst's reports. She went around and talked to working class women and surveyed them about their politics. When you read the kinds of women that they spoke to, the kind of things they say, I would be amazed. A lot of them are. I'd be amazed if some of them hadn't seen the inside of a match factory, because practically everybody did in the East End, if you're an East End woman at some stage in your life. So there's no proven crossover between that and the suffragettes, but I'd be amazed if not. Again, massive working class component to the suffragette movement, but all we ever hear about is bloody Mrs. Pankhurst. Christabel, so pretty in her hats. I've actually heard it suggested that the reason Sylvia and Christabel fell out was because Christabel was prettier and Sylvia was jealous. It wasn't Sylvia's anti-imperialist, anti-racist, anti-war politics. No, my sister's prettier, she's got better hats, the bitch. It's not fair. I love that kind of reductionism. It's fantastic, isn't it? Were they unionised? No, they weren't. Trade unions sometimes made attempts to organise working class women and casual workers. Generally, attempts to do that were left to the people outside the movement, middle class women like the trade union leagues, who generally didn't tend to get on with the TUC. Henry Broadhurst of the TUC said it in 1960-something that it should be the aim of the TUC to return our wives and daughters to the home. So he went along with that domestic ideology idea. They formed a union. Bryant and May were forced to let them form a union, the Union of Women Matchmakers, the largest female union in the country, as a result of the strike. The GMB are actually the Matchwomen's Union. I tell Paul Kenny that every year when I try and get a donation off him for the Matchwomen's Festival, because the union went into the GMB in 1920, even though people have said, an American academic wrote about it and said it was a very unimportant union because it folded in 1920. Well, it didn't. It went into the GMB. And anyway, it survived the massive employer fight back against new unionism, which a lot of unions didn't. And they still went on strike after 1888. One of the things Annie Besant says to them, which so categorises her view, at a final meeting she says, now girls, I've talked to that nice Mr. Bryant, and he is a bit cross with you, you've been a bit naughty by going on strike, but as long as you don't do it again, he's willing to make some concessions. And you won't do it again, will you? And they did. They consistently, Annie Besant had gone off to Middle Eastern religious stuff, and they absolutely kept on going on strike consistently over Fossey Jaw and so forth. Yes, it was a fire risk. Yes, they used to get fined for burns because occasionally matches would catch fire during the production process, so Bryant and May fined them for it, obviously, because that's their fault, because they're fire starters, twisted fire starters, and they're making the matches burst into flames. Bryant and May still in business, kind of. Bry May matches are now made in Sweden by Swedish Match. Swedish Match refused to give me an apology and a cheque for the Match Women's Festival. I did try. I said a nice big cheque and a public apology, truth and reconciliation. They told me to get stuffed in perfect English, like the Swedes always do. But I have got them to say that I can use the Bryant and May archive, which is in England, but which they technically own, after many months of letters between me and Swedish lawyers, which was a lot of fun. So they have at least done that. But Bryant and May were horrified about the strike and the legacy of it. Even in the 1960s, there's records in their archives of people saying, hello, I'm from the Nuneaton Amateur Dramatics Association, and we're putting on the play Match Girls, and could you send us some stuff from the factory so that we've got some stuff from the stage? And there's increasingly pissed off letters back. No, we haven't got any photographs, we don't know what you're talking about. What strike? There wasn't a strike. Look over there. Fossey Jaw, never heard of it. And they try to stop films being made, they try to get scripts altered. Eventually their solicitor has to go, look guys, you're going to have to kind of just embrace the Fossey Jaw thing, you're going to have to admit this happened, it's part of the industrial heritage, you can't just sort of make it go away. They were forced to become quite a good employer, but make no mistake about it, they were forced. They did not do it willingly. And I think that's the lesson of the Match Women, really. And that's what we can take into today. No matter how people tell you you have no power, and they always will, no matter how people tell you that a few people can't change anything, nonsense. As that great revolutionary Frances O'Grady at the TUC, proven Match Women's fan, she is on record as saying she's a Match Women's fan, said, take power. Make up the rules. Don't worry about what people tell you about what the rules are and the power you have or haven't had. It's up to you, up to all of us, to just go and take it. Start the revolution now.